Is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 13th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Thank you for joining us today. The highlights under Business and Finance are: Powell framed the Justice Department's opening of a criminal probe into him as a direct challenge to the Fed's ability to operate free of political control. Former Fed and Treasury officials rushed to defend Powell and the Fed's independence, calling the probe unprecedented and its intent an affront to American principles. U.S. stocks wavered in early trading but recovered to lift both the S&P 500 and Dow by 0.2% to records, and the NASDAQ by 0.3%. Japan's Nikkei surged to a record intraday high on expectations of a snap election. U.S. banks are entering the new year on solid footing after a strong 2025, and analysts say that momentum should continue. Meta Platforms undertook an initiative led by top executives to secure the enormous amounts of computing power required by its AI models. Shake Shack said inclement weather in some markets hurt sales during the second quarter, resulting in lower than expected revenue. Abercrombie and Fitch and Urban Outfitters continued to record strong sales despite weak consumer sentiment, though the retailers missed analyst estimates. Airbus met an annual plane delivery goal that the European market recently lowered due to a quality issue with hundreds of A320 jets. Mercedes-Benz car sales fell 9% to 1.8 million vehicles in 2025 amid a challenging global market as sales dropped in the U.S. and China. VW delivered slightly fewer cars last year as the maker was hit by trade disruption from U.S. tariffs and fierce competition in China. Now for the key articles under the Worldwide section. Trump has complained to aides repeatedly in recent weeks about Attorney General Pam Bondi, describing her as weak and an ineffective enforcer of his agenda. Senator Mark Kelly sued Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, saying the Pentagon's chief's move to formally censure and demote him for participating in a video calling on troops to disobey illegal orders violates the Constitution. Minnesota sued U.S. immigration officials seeking to end what the state called an unlawful surge of federal agents within its borders. TSMC, the world's largest fabricator of advanced artificial intelligence chips, is planning a significant expansion in Arizona as part of a potential trade agreement between the U.S. and Taiwan. Nearly 15,000 New York City nurses walked off the job, calling attention to sticking points in contract talks that include health care benefits, staffing standards, and workplace violation protections. Prominent advocates for overhauls in Iran are supporting a crackdown on anti-government protesters as the regime closes ranks in the face of one of the biggest challenges to its power. U.S. military and diplomatic officials said Trump's rationale for asserting a claim to Greenland defies decades of policy and undermines American strategic goals. United Health employed aggressive tactics to collect payment-boosting diagnoses for its Medicare Advantage members, a Senate panel investigating the company's practices said. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum rejected an offer from Trump to use the U.S. military against the drug cartels operating in her country. The picture on today's front page shows students with their backpacks walking past a huge mural of Venezuela's late President Hugo Chavez. And the article, U.S. Tries Fresh Tack on Regime Change, by David Ludlow. In the aftermath of the U.S. raid to seize Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro, Washington is trying a new approach to regime change. Keep the regime and try to change its behavior. Having removed Maduro from power, the Trump administration has kept the rest of the dictatorship's hardliners in place, including top officials wanted by the U.S. for drug trafficking and other crimes. It also has gone out of its way to play down the importance of the Venezuelan opposition. The goal, administration officials said, is to force Venezuela's leaders in a more U.S.-friendly direction without risking the instability that comes with removing an autocratic government that has been in power for 27 years. Ultimately, it seeks to avoid U.S. boots on the ground in the kind of open-ended occupation that troubled U.S. efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan and proved unpopular with the public. This is not a regime change as traditionally conceived. It is regime management, an attempt to reshape behavior without collapsing the system that produces it, said Christopher Hernandez-Roy, an analyst at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., who specializes in Latin America. The idea, he said, is to manage Venezuela rather than liberate it. It is far too early to tell if the strategy will pay off, but its initial success means it could become a template for handling other regimes, such as the one in Iran, where the Trump administration is considering strikes against a theocratic government amid a crackdown on protest. Cuba's ossified communist regime could be another target, some analysts said. By taking out Maduro, the Trump administration hopes to get practical change on the cheap, including forcing Venezuela to open its oil industry to U.S. and foreign companies, reduce the flow of drugs to the U.S., and box out China, Russia, and Iran. Any kind of transition to democracy seems a lower priority, at least for now. The approach might be called nation coaching rather than nation building, said Javier Corrales, a political scientist whose research at Amherst College has focused on democracy in Latin America. It's an innovative strategy, Corrales said. The U.S. wants tangible changes from Venezuela's regime, but it doesn't want to send in the Marines, so it outsources stability on the ground to the regime. The big question is whether it will work, he said. For most ordinary Venezuelans, the approach could avoid a bloody civil conflict, but it dashes their hopes of a quick transition to democracy or economic recovery. More than a week after the ouster of Maduro, the same corrupt regime remains in place, with armed paramilitary squads roaming the streets. One encouraging sign is that several dozen political prisoners have been released in the past week. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, whom Trump has said lacks the clout to manage a transition in Venezuela, is due to meet Trump on Thursday. She is expected to press him on pushing a transition in Venezuela. Although it doesn't have boots on the ground, the U.S. has leverage. The threat of more military action against uncooperative regime members and the ability to seize Venezuela's oil exports to starve the regime of money. Whether that leverage is enough to press regime leaders to make meaningful changes, like an eventual transition to democracy, remains to be seen. Fed chief hits back at Trump. Powell avoided for years taking on the president directly. That is now over. By Nick Timiraeus. For years, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has responded to President Trump's broadsides in ways that generally avoided escalation. That changed on Sunday night. In an extraordinary 2-minute video message, Powell accused the administration of using the threat of criminal prosecution to pressure the Fed into lowering rates. He framed the Justice Department investigation as nothing less than a head-on challenge to the Fed's ability to operate free of political control. The subpoenas arrived late Friday. Powell, a lawyer by training, spent the weekend huddled with advisors, weighing how to respond. Powell made clear by releasing the video statement that he wasn't going to let this play out in the shadows. A criminal investigation of a sitting chair is without precedent, and Powell's message was too. It was wrapped in a directness that he had spent years avoiding. Powell often chooses his words carefully, and Sunday's unusually stern delivery lacked the diplomatic off-ramp and studied neutrality of his past comments about the White House. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president, Powell said. By going public, Powell was making sure that pressure applied in private couldn't stay private. The decision to disclose the investigation appeared to reflect a belief that the public should know what was unfolding. The threat of the prosecution of a sitting Fed chair would be material information for investors or anyone else trying to understand the forces shaping interest rate deliberations. On Monday, former Fed officials and lawmakers from both sides of the aisle criticized the Powell investigation. The probe also sparked unease on Wall Street, where many investors have long believed the Fed should be free from political influence when setting rates. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. President ramps up private criticism of Bondi. Complaints in recent weeks center on failed prosecutions, handling of Epstein. By Josh Dawsey, Sadie Gurman, and C. Ryan Barber. President Trump has complained to aides repeatedly in recent weeks about Attorney General Pam Bondi, describing her as weak and an ineffective enforcer of his agenda. Administration officials and other people familiar with his complaints said. The criticisms appear to be part of an intense campaign by Trump to pressure the Justice Department to more aggressively pursue his priorities, some of the officials said. Trump has previously criticized Bondi at times, but his vocal concerns about his attorney general have grown more frequent in recent months, officials said. This month, Trump has talked with allies about how he could appoint special counsels at the Justice Department because he is so frustrated with what he sees as the slow progress of its work, people familiar with the matter said. Chief among his grievances is what he sees as Bondi's failure to quickly and effectively prosecute the investigators who had pursued him for years, including former FBI Director James Comey and New York Democratic Attorney General Letitia James, the officials and others familiar with his complaints said. Both criminal cases were dismissed in November by a judge who said the Trump aide who secured the indictment had been improperly appointed to her post. A Justice Department investigation into another of Trump's antagonists, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, became public on Sunday night. Powell disclosed that the Justice Department was pursuing a criminal investigation over his testimony last summer about the central bank's building renovation. Trump, a Republican, has also complained frequently that Bondi's handling of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's files on convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein has created months of political and personal headaches for him, officials familiar with the complaint said. When White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles told Vanity Fair that Bondi whiffed on her handling of the files, Trump told staff that he agreed with Wiles, two officials said. Middle Class Gets Priced Out of Florida Retirement by Ariane Campo Flores and Paul Overbrook, Sarasota, Florida. Michelle Butler and Wells Chapin moved to the west coast of Florida from Michigan in 2023 in anticipation of her plan to exit the restaurant business and join her partner in retirement. They bought a $950,000 home at a new resort-style development in Lakewood Ranch, just outside Sarasota, that draws many new, well-heeled retirees. Butler, 70 years old, and Chapin, 82, golf at the 18-hole course, ride bikes on winding trails, and enjoy sunsets on their lanai. The following year, Jim and Nina Cope headed in the opposite direction, selling their mobile home in a retirement community in Avon Park, Florida, for $59,000 after repeated rent hikes for the lot. The couple, who are now in their mid-80s, bought a home for $40,000 in Haleyville, Alabama, where their living expenses are more manageable with the income they get from Social Security and his Navy retirement benefits. The experience of both couples reflect a new reality about the Sunshine State. Its older population is transforming as the state's cost of living balloon. Wealthy individuals, making up a growing share of people at or near retirement age arriving in Florida from other states, according to U.S. Census Bureau data, while many working and middle-class older people who feel priced out are moving elsewhere. The new patterns of migration are helping reshape Florida's identity, swapping its long-held reputation as a paradise for retirees of all stripes for one that primarily caters to the well-heeled. The decades-old promise of an affordable, sun-drenched sanctuary is fading in the face of high home prices, insurance premiums, and property taxes, among other costs. Washington's new lobbyist, paid online influencers. Corporate and foreign interests seek to push their causes with pro-Trump social media stars who face few rules. By Maggie Severance, Natalie Andrews, Josh Dawsey, and Eliza Collins. Last summer, Donald Trump's 28-year-old former campaign aide, Alex Bruesewitz, had some new advice for the president. Reclassify marijuana as a less dangerous drug. Nearly 70% of Republican voters support Trump on this. No-brainer, he said, to more than 640,000 followers on X. What Bruesewitz left out of the post? A political action committee funded by legal marijuana's biggest players had just paid him $300,000. Trump's return to the White House has transformed the federal government and upended the business of lobbying, creating a class of Washington operatives that blur the lines between consulting, advocacy, and journalism. Corporate and foreign interests that used to rely primarily on paid lobbyists to pitch their case to lawmakers and administration officials are instead pouring money into trying to get their cause promoted by a group of young, conservative influencers known to be close to Trump's staff. A camera-ready pack of Gen Z social media natives, many of whom were too young to vote when Trump announced his first run for president, are reaping the rewards. They don't work for traditional news outlets and are thus unshackled from newsroom ethics rules. They don't have to follow the disclosure laws that apply to big money super PACs or lobbyists, and they have large followings eager to hear pro-Trump views, a goldmine for those looking to sway both Washington and the public. Iran moderates back crackdown on unrest. Tehran urges backers to take to the streets, labels critics agents of U.S. and Israel. By Benoit Falcon. Prominent advocates for overhauls in Iran are supporting a crackdown on anti-government protesters as the regime closes ranks in the face of one of the biggest challenges to its powers. They include President Masoud Pezeshkian, who at first advocated for a more conciliatory approach to the protesters, but is now calling for police to rein in rioters. Other prominent so-called reformists to call for a crackdown include a grandson of former leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and others who push the government to liberalize after a round of protest against the compulsory veil in 2022. As the protests grow into a more serious threat to Iran's rulers, regime supporters are afraid they will go down with any collapse of the Islamic Republic, Iran analysts said. The protests are no longer about transforming the regime, but overthrowing it, said Sanan Vakil, director of the Middle East North Africa program at Britain's Royal Institute of International Affairs, or Chatham House. For the reformers, too, if the ship goes down, they are sinking with it, she said. In response, President Trump is stepping up his threats against Iran. We are looking at some very strong options, he said on Monday. The president is scheduled to be briefed on Tuesday on options to respond to the Islamic Republic's crackdown on protesters, including placing more sanctions on Iran or military strikes, the Wall Street Journal reported. Iran has threatened to retaliate against U.S. military bases in the Middle East. Trump said, if that happens, we will hit them at levels that they've never been hit before. Over 500 people have so far been killed in the protest, according to human rights activists in Iran, nearly 50 of whom were members of security services. Over 10,000 have been arrested, the group said. Internet access has been blocked for most Iranians since Thursday, but some images of the protests are still getting through. A large crowd of protesters gathered late Sunday in a North Tehran neighborhood, chanting freedom and lighting fires, according to videos posted on social media and verified by Storyful, which is owned by News Corp, the parent company of the Wall Street Journal. Experts reject U.S. logic on Greenland. Trump's assertion about the need to own the island to defend it defies policy. By Daniel Michaels. President Trump's assertion that the U.S. must own Greenland to expand its defenses there runs counter to decades of policy and undermines the deterrence of its global network of bases and alliances, former U.S. military and diplomatic officials said. Trump has said the U.S. should have full control of the island, a semi-autonomous Danish territory. He has said the U.S. needs to own it to assure Arctic and U.S. security. But military officials and diplomats say the U.S. has built the world's most formidable assembly of overseas military bases without owning foreign soil. The Defense Department manages or uses more than 128 foreign bases in at least 51 countries, according to a Congressional Research Service report from 2024. Independent analysis have said the total number could top 750 installations in 80 countries and territories. In nearly all cases, land is provided by host countries under bilateral agreements without a change of ownership. Host countries generally permit the U.S. to build and operate facilities, as spelled out in diplomatic documents. We don't need ownership in order to conduct all the operations we would like to do, said retired Navy Admiral James Stavridis, a former Supreme Allied Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Overseas bases are the backbone of America's global defense posture. Of 1.3 million active duty U.S. military personnel, nearly 13,000 are based overseas, the Defense Department says the biggest U.S. overseas military installations are in Japan, Germany, and South Korea. Those countries and other allies not only provide land, but also contribute to operating cost. According to the Pentagon, more than 53,000 active duty troops are stationed in bases across Japan, and more than 36,000 are in Germany. Landstuhl Regional Medical Center there is the Pentagon's largest overseas medical facility, treating service members from across the hemisphere. The adjacent Ramstein Air Base employs more than 12,000 service members and civilians on about 4,000 acres. During the past 15 or so years, the Pentagon has shifted from running its own large overseas installations to using sites belonging to allies and partners, an approach dubbed places, not bases, according to the congressional report. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, Seattle reverts to progressive form. The new city attorney is reluctant to press charges for drug use. Seattle residents voted for new left-wing leaders in November, and they are getting what they may end up paying for. New progressive city attorney Erica Evans campaigned on leniency for low-level crimes, and she's already following through. In a January 1st memo, Ms. Evans outlined how her criminal division should respond when police refer cases involving the knowing possession or public use of drugs. It instructs prosecutors to immediately refer the case to be considered for the diversions program prior to any filing action. King County describes the diversions program as a way of bypassing prosecution and jail time and instead connecting lawbreakers with case managers, housing, and other taxpayer-funded support. Ms. Evans's memo says a diversions liaison will have a say about how to handle even cases when a drug user with prior offenses has failed to demonstrate a sustained level or engagement with diversions program or refused to engage with a case manager. This approach looks more like enabling drug use than reducing it. Police can still make arrests, but Ms. Evans's reluctance to file charges means more drug offenders will end up back on Seattle streets rather than in a treatment program. She has also opposed the stay out orders that restricted those arrested for drug offenses from loitering in Seattle's downtown and other areas as a condition of pre-trial release. Needle Parks, welcome back. Ms. Evans easily defeated Law and Order incumbent Ann Davidson in November, so voters can hardly complain. Yet, a fall 2025 survey by the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce also shows voters still view crime, drugs, and public safety as a top concern, second only to homelessness. Enjoy getting what you voted for, Emerald City residents. Iran's regime massacres its own people. The mullahs cross Trump's red line. How will he respond? Unable to govern its people, Iran's regime has resorted to shooting them. The enforcers for the ruling mullahs have killed at least 500 protesters and likely thousands crossing President Trump's red line. If they start killing people like they have in the past, we will get involved, Mr. Trump reiterated Friday. You better not start shooting because we'll start shooting too. The regime isn't listening. Trump says things like this a lot. Don't take him seriously. Iran's National Security Council chief Ali Larijani said Monday. He's a top advisor to the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who shared a cartoon of Mr. Trump as a crumbling sarcophagus. This one too will be overthrown, he wrote. If they could dance like Nicolas Maduro, they would. Iran has cut off internet and phone service for more than 4 days to cover up the slaughter. But videos have leaked to the world even as Iranians are trapped. Hospitals overflow with dead and wounded, and at least 10,000 protesters have been arrested, rights groups say. One verified video shows 180 body bags dumped and laid out at a Tehran morgue for families of the missing to search through. But thuggery won't resurrect the currency, stabilize prices, or provide electricity and water. Iran's problems are intractable so long as this regime remains, and Iranians know it. Mr. Trump acknowledged Sunday that the Ayatollah is crossing his red line, but he added, yesterday the leaders of Iran called. They want to negotiate. A meeting is being set up, though the U.S. may have to strike first in response to the killing, Mr. Trump said. The offer to negotiate is the regime's usual ploy to buy time. The Ayatollah has made clear he won't budge on enrichment of nuclear fuel, and his foreign minister still insults Mr. Trump by floating an Obama-style deal. New talks would betray the protesters by legitimizing their regime and lending it an economic reprieve. That would be the Obama move, and the regime would claim victory. Mr. Trump's instinct is better. If Iran were to slaughter protesters, he warned on Friday, we will be hitting them very hard where it hurts. The question is how to hit them in a way that helps protesters while damaging the regime. Now regime forces can coordinate, but the people can't. Anything the U.S. can do to reverse that will be essential. This is where cyber capabilities come in handy. Covert operations are another option. Aggressive sanctions enforcement is also essential, seizing the oil tankers whose revenue sustains the regime. Military attacks would stun the regime, though they carry the risk of civilian and U.S. casualties. Targets could include Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps headquarters, leaders and units coordinating the crackdown, the Karg Island export terminal, from which Iran delivers China its daily advantage in discounted oil, and the ballistic missile program, and what's left of the nuclear program. One myth not to indulge is that a military strike would cause the public to rally round the regime. That's what the experts claimed if the U.S. bombed Iran's nuclear facilities. An effective U.S. policy would support Iran's people for as long as it takes them to overwhelm the regime until it becomes paralyzed, shows cracks in its leadership, and can no longer hold back the crowds. Mr. Trump promised to intervene if the regime resorted to mass murder, and the protesters heard him and are dying in the streets. Night after night, they challenge a regime that they know will meet them with bullets. Death to America, the Ayatollah and his minions chant. The people of Iran will have to win their own freedom, but this is an historic moment when America can help them topple a dangerous tyranny. From the opinion pages, Trump captivates the globe. For him, extreme volatility and risk are not a problem, but an opportunity. By Walter Russell Mead. Is Iran next? That was the question the world was asking this weekend. As both protest and repression escalated, President Trump repeatedly warned that the U.S. would not stand idly by if the theocracy in Tehran fired on protesters. The mullahs' response came from their usual playbook. They carried out a bloodbath and threatened to attack American bases and assets across the region if Mr. Trump raised a hand against them. As in Venezuela, Russia and China aren't doing much either way. Joint exercises involving the Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and South African navies off the Cape of Good Hope sent a signal about their growing ambitions and capabilities, but had little bearing on events in the Middle East. This is world politics the way Mr. Trump likes it. Last week, it was his seizure of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. In a raid of extraordinary daring and competency that stunned the world. Then came his threats against Greenland, setting Europe in an uproar with a few casual remarks. The Europeans sounded tough, but as usual, were industriously signaling weakness. As European leaders vied to decry the projected American power grab in the Arctic, the French quietly shifted the date of next summer's Group of Seven summit so as not to conflict with the Ultimate Fighting Championship event scheduled at the White House to celebrate Mr. Trump's birthday. Although American intellectuals and journalists emotionally committed to the Trump as Putin puppet fantasy will resist the conclusion, Vladimir Putin is the man who has the most to lose from Mr. Trump's current international trajectory. The removal of Mr. Maduro and the pressure on Tehran threaten decades of patient Russian investment and alliance building. They also will depress oil prices as sanctions disappear and production in those snake-bit economies recovers. As the president set American foreign policy on a global interventionist path that would leave Dick Cheney gasping in amazement, he threw some bones to the isolationist wing of his mega coalition. U.S. planning meetings with Israel over attacks on Iran were balanced with a cordial lunch at the White House for Tucker Carlson on Friday. Steve Bannon acolytes fuming over Mr. Trump's global ambitions rejoiced at his populist call for caps on credit card interest and proposal to ban Wall Street from investing in single-family homes. Will it all work out as the president hopes? Will Venezuela continue to follow his lead? Will the Iranian regime fall with limited American engagement? Will the gestures toward the populist wing of his coalition offset their discontent with global Trumpism? Nobody knows for sure, including Mr. Trump. But while other American presidents would view this extreme volatility and risk as a problem to be solved, the current president sees it as a condition to exploit. It is not merely that his high wire act supports and intensifies the drama and excitement that made him the dominant figure in American and then global politics for the past decade. It is also that his ability, real or perceived, to change the course of world politics on a whim increases his leverage at home and abroad. When a man can make war or peace, promote a block trade, make you rich, or freeze you out, other people do what they can to stay on his good side. Imagine for a moment that Mr. Trump's various gambles pay off. Cuba presumably will have to make its peace with America if Venezuela cuts off the oil and Washington tightens the screws on Havana. If 6 months from now Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran have all changed alignment, Mr. Trump will tower above his recent predecessors. If he ends up with some kind of victory in Greenland, yet with leading European nations still committed to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and raising their defense spending to 5% of gross domestic product, historians are unlikely to call him a flop. It is, however, at least equally possible that it all goes awry. Venezuela could collapse, leading to new refugee flows and providing everyone from drug lords to terrorists with safe havens and opportunities to make trouble. Israeli or American attacks on Iran could fail, leaving the mullahs in power and White House prestige badly dented. Key allies in Europe and Asia could be so deeply alienated by erratic policy making, angry rhetoric, and contempt for their interest that the foundations of American power could be irretrievably weakened. A mega revolt would break or at least compromise Mr. Trump's power over the GOP. If Mr. Trump fails, his successors will struggle to clean up the mess he leaves behind. If he succeeds, he will have built a new world. In the moment of maximum drama and uncertainty in which we now live, nobody knows what the outcome will be. Your Global View columnist is only confident that, whatever is coming next, it won't be boring. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Iran cracks down. Where are the Western protests? It's a bit like Gaza, says a BBC journalist, in what is an unintentionally revealing remark. By Gerard Baker. As the people of Iran brave another intensifying crackdown by their rulers after another effort to reclaim their basic rights from one of the world's most repressive regimes, my question is, where are the protests in the West? Specifically, where are those defenders of persecuted Muslims who have been so active on the streets of New York, London, Sydney, Rome, and elsewhere the past 2 years? Where are the demands for justice and freedom for the downtrodden victims of a brutally repressive state? What is so different about the cause they have been espousing in their demonstrations over Gaza and the cause of millions of innocent co-religionists 1,000 miles to their east? Those kafifa-wearing, banner-waving, slogan-chanting activists say they were moved to protest, sometimes violently and unlawfully, by the plight of Muslims dispossessed of their lands and livelihoods, immiserated, starved, beaten, and murdered by a savage regime. In Iran, this has been happening for decades. More than 3 million Iranians have been driven from their homeland in the 47 years of the mullah's rule. People have been forced into prison, literal ones, not the metaphoric open-air prison of Gaza, or into exile in foreign lands, their homes and property stolen, their loved ones punished, and frequently murdered. Over the past 2 weeks, the clash between good and evil has seemed to be approaching a climax, and the brutality has escalated. Where are the student radicals disrupting classes? We all marveled at Queers for Palestine. Why don't we have Queers for Iran, a country whose official attitude toward homosexuality is similar to Hamas's? Where are the movie stars and pop icons with their beautifully produced, plangent, extremely loud video pleas for justice? Why haven't we heard condemnations for Zohran Mamdani, the mayor of New York, or Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, pledging solidarity with the Iranians and demanding the end of the theocratic occupation? Why hasn't dear little Greta Thunberg gotten herself arrested for passionately supporting the Iranian people against their overlords? Where is the International Criminal Court's crack team of lawyers to investigate crimes against humanity and issue indictments against Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, and Masoud Pezeshkian, the country's president, as they did for Benjamin Netanyahu? I was in London this past weekend. Unlike my recent trips there, this one wasn't interrupted by mass demonstrations on behalf of persecuted Muslims. There was a small gathering against the Iranian regime, and a courageous young man scaled the walls of the Iranian embassy, removing the Islamic Republic's flag from its balcony and replacing it with the flag of the former regime. But there was nothing of the energy or scale of the anti-Israel marches. Perhaps part of the reason for the silence is that people aren't getting the information out of Iran that they need to get them off their backsides and into the streets. In the UK, there has been criticism that the BBC and other major media organizations spent days playing down or even ignoring the dramatic events in Iran. John Simpson, one of the grandest of the BBC Grand Panjandrums, self-important or pretentious official, was one of many journalists to spring to their own defense. He noted how difficult it is to get accurate and reliable information given the reporting conditions in the country. Very difficult for news organizations to get correspondents in. The BBC is banned, and so are most others, he tweeted. And then, in a moment of almost picturesque lack of self-awareness, he added, "It's a bit like Gaza." No, Mr. Simpson, it isn't a bit like Gaza, where the scarcity of reliable information didn't stop the BBC and many of its peers from broadcasting daily for 2 years the most lurid accounts of the Israeli offensive there, much of it pure Hamas lies. Perhaps the strangely muted, vigilant defenders of the Middle East most persecuted could make the case that we in the West are already at least trying to weaken the Iranian regime. We don't sell it arms or work with it as an ally, unlike Israel. It's true that Iran is subject to sanctions, but this is no thanks to the left over here or most of the Europeans who have been so fiercely critical of Israel. Successive democratic demonstrations in the U.S. worked with European governments to try to coax Iran back into the international fold. which may provide a further clue to the lack of heightened passion for Iranians. It has something to do with politics. President Trump has led the way in diplomatically isolating Iran again in both his first and second terms. He has gone much further the first time around with the elimination of Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Quds Force, and in this term with the attack on the Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear facilities. Washington's leadership has clearly weakened Tehran's grip. Some people, no doubt, would rather see Mr. Trump denied a foreign policy success than see 90 million people liberated from tyranny. And who knows, to indulge my cynicism fully for a moment, perhaps the reason so many protesters condemn Israel for its legitimate actions and give Iran a pass for its illegitimate ones is that, unlike Israel, Iran isn't run by Jews. The Pepper and Salt cartoon takes place in a winter scene with a mountain in the background as two men are seated on boxes, warming their hands over a kerosene fire where a pot of water seems to be boiling. And the caption reads, "The snow has turned to water. Now we just need something that turns into an all-you-can-eat buffet." Yesterday's Pepper and Salt cartoon shows a boss seated at his desk as what appears to be a senior employee seated in a chair opposite him. And the caption reads, "I don't know how to put this, but your replacement Chat GPT does." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 13th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening, and stay warm.
You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Volunteer radio readers broadcast daily readings, 24 hours a day, of newspapers, magazines, books, and other printed matter to area people who are blind or have a print disability, who are provided reading radios. The Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service has broadcast almost 40 years of radio readings to those without sight. Our broadcast signal is provided at no charge by WNED. Radio reading studios are at 1199 Harlem Road in Cheektowaga. For more information on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, call 716-821-5555.